Hello again. It's time to return our attention to Augustine of Hippo, a giant of the church. We have very briefly surveyed his life up until the time when he was elected Bishop of Hippo. And so now we will begin a discussion of his writings and his developing theology. First of all, we want to talk about his Confessions. This is considered the first autobiography written in the Western world, and it is a spiritual autobiography written as a prayer, and it is addressed to God the Father. Not merely a recital of his life story, and Augustine does not try to embellish the good or minimize the evil of his life. In fact, it is from his confessions that we have learned exactly how sinful he was in his early life. In one incident that he relates, he tells about the pear tree incident. As a teenager, he and his group broke into a neighbor's orchard and stole pears from his trees. Not interested in the pears themselves, they just threw them to the pigs. He simply wanted to enjoy the thrill of theft. And later in Book 2 of Confessions, he expresses his remorse. The evil in me was foul, but I loved it. A very personal confession on his part, and one with which many of us might be able to identify. Another well-known writing by Augustine is The City of God. This presents Augustine's theology of history. It was written in the aftermath of the fall of Rome to Vandals in 410. The pagan Romans, who still had not converted to the official religion, Christianity, they blamed this disaster on Christians, and they felt that they had abandoned the Roman gods, who in turn had abandoned them. And so the City of God is Augustine's answer and a statement of his philosophy of history. According to Augustine, there are two concurrent cities, both built on love. The city of God, built on the love of God, and the earthly city, built on the love of self. Both are intermingled, but they are irreconcilable. Kingdoms and nations built on the love of self will fall, but the city of God will remain. For scriptural support for this idea, Augustine depended upon Jesus' parable of the wheat and the tares. Both the wheat and the tares grew up together, as do the city of God and the earthly city. And yet at the end, only the wheat will survive, in the same way only the city of God will survive. God allowed Rome to flourish for the sake of the gospel, and so Augustine recognized the value of the Roman Empire for the spread of the church. But now God was allowing Rome to follow the destiny of all human kingdoms as punishment for their sins. Now let's move into a series of polemical writings where Augustine argues against rivals to Orthodox Christianity. And first, he turns his attention to Manichaeism. He felt responsible to refute the teachings that he had supported earlier because many of his associates had converted to Manichaeism because of his influence. And as we have said, good and evil, according to Manichaeism, are two eternal principles at war, and a human being is on one side or another. So Augustine taught in his polemical writings against the Manichees that a human being has free will. He or she is not predetermined. Evil is departure from good, just as darkness is the absence of light. But evil is not an eternal principle. Only God is eternal. Another group against which he aimed his polemical writings were the Donatists. Donatism was centered in North Africa, and their issue was the validity of ordination and sacraments conferred by unworthy bishops. They demanded that their candidates be rebaptized in order to join the true and pure church of the Donatists. And also, as we will see, they opposed the state intervention in the church. They were opposed to the union of church and state. Let me give you some background to the Donatist controversy. Just as there was controversy following the Decian persecution, there was similar controversy following the Great Persecution, when some of the bishops caved into pressure from Diocletian and Galerius, and they turned over the scriptures. As you recall, these bishops who weakened were known as traditors. Okay. In Carthage, the bishop Mensurius and his deacon Caecilian were accused of weakening. Not that they turned over the scriptures, no, they hid them, but they surrendered heretical works in order to shield themselves from persecution. After Mensurius, then Caecilian was elected as bishop of Carthage. But in the more rural region of Numidia, which surrounds Carthage, their bishops elected Majorinus and then Donatus, and it is from the bishop Donatus of Numidia that Donatism takes its name. Donatus led a schismatic movement that criticized the Carthaginian church because not only were their bishops weak, and not only had they apostatized by surrendering even fake scriptures, but those whom Mensurius and Caecilian ordained were not true bishops. The sacraments that they offered were not worthy sacraments, and so they formed a separate Donatist church that often functioned side by side with the more established church of the day. The more extreme factions among the Donatists actually responded militarily against the established church, who in turn were supported by the empire, okay, because the established church was obviously the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so Augustine had much to say in response to the Donatists, as well as to their violent faction known as the Circumcellions. Now, Augustine claimed that the validity of ordination and the sacraments comes from the authority of Christ, not the character of the minister. Again, he pointed to Jesus' parable of the wheat and tares to describe the visible church, which contains both the saved and the lost. Furthermore, in the controversy, in the argument between the established church and the Donatists, Augustine taught that the compulsion in faith is right. It is an act of love to bring one into the true faith and into the true church. And it is out of this controversy that Augustine taught his doctrine of the just war. Augustine taught that civil government should enforce proper worship of God and the belief in correct doctrine. Now, this theory of just war still influences governmental decisions today when it is necessary to declare war against an enemy. So it was against the violence of the Circumcellions that Augustine advanced his theory of just war. First, the purpose of war must be just. It must be waged by properly instituted authority. And in Augustine's opinion, the Donatists were not authorized because they were the schismatic church. Even in violence, according to Augustine, the motive of love must be central. And so Augustine would teach that love was the motive, as those in the established church acted against the Donatists in the hope to bring them back into the traditional, established, true Christian faith. Okay, so right or wrong, this was Augustine's response to the Donatists and his theory of just war. Next, he turned his attention to Pelagius, and it was his polemical writings against Pelagianism that probably have influenced later theology more than almost anything else that he wrote. Now, Pelagius was a monk from Britain, famous for his piety and austerity. And according to Pelagius, the Christian life is a constant effort through which one's sins are overcome and salvation attained. Works of obedience, therefore, are the key to salvation. But note Pelagius's lifestyle, a monastic lifestyle, pious and austere. For Pelagius, it came naturally, or at least through constant effort, to overcome his sinful tendencies to perform works of obedience and therefore to attain salvation. Now, Augustine, of course, came from an entirely different background. He remembered before conversion, he could not will to be a Christian. He could not bring his will to overcome his sexual appetites. And so he taught that the power of sin takes hold of our will. We cannot move our will against it. We are still free, but we are free only to sin. When we are redeemed, we are free both to sin and not to sin. It is only in heaven that we are free not to sin. And so, for Augustine, grace is irresistible, given by God only to those who have been predestined. Augustine felt that he was predestined for salvation, and therefore God's grace was irresistible. When he read those words in the book of Romans, finally God's grace broke through Augustine's sinful will to enable him to be free, to shed his sexual inclinations, to be saved. And so you can see how Augustine's past influenced his theology of salvation. Let's talk terminology. First of all, let's look at the idea of original sin. According to Augustine, we inherit our sin nature from Adam. We are not free not to sin. Therefore, we are not free to accept grace. In Romans 5:12, we read Paul saying, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned." So Augustine teaches that we inherit our sin nature from Adam, and we have no freedom not to sin. According to Pelagius, we are born free not to sin. Pelagius sees humanity as born with freedom to live a works-oriented, salvation-worthy life. Now, Augustine would teach the mass of damnation. Because of original sin, all humanity is born into a mass of damnation. According to Augustine's doctrine of predestination, God reaches down and chooses the elect who are saved through the external work of the Word and the internal work of the Spirit. But according to Augustine's doctrine, which we call single predestination, God passes over those who are not elect. He does not predestine them to damnation. They are condemned because of their sin nature. Let me recap. All of humanity is born into a mass of damnation. God reaches down and chooses the elect who are saved. He passes over the remainder of humanity. They are not elected to damnation, but nonetheless they are condemned because they are born into a sin nature. Now, later on, John Calvin, influenced by Augustine, will teach a double predestination. He will carry this idea of predestination a step further. He will teach that God elects some to salvation, but he elects others to damnation. This is from his Institutes of the Christian Religion, Book 3, Chapter 21. So Augustine influenced Calvin's view of predestination, but Calvin took it one step further than Augustine. Now let's look at the Pelagian controversy. In this chart, these several charts following, there is a comparison between Augustine and Pelagius according to a number of different views. Regarding humanity before the fall, both Augustine and Pelagius believed that Adam and Eve were innocent with free will. But according to Pelagius, death would have come anyway. They were mortal. Augustine, however, believed they were immortal, so that humanity after the fall suffered both spiritual and physical death. The entire race then suffered through Adam, and most important, everyone is born with the guilt of Adam, and therefore they have a corrupt human nature. Notice they're not born simply with the sin nature, they're born with the guilt of Adam, and therefore are condemned because they share Adam's guilt. Now, Pelagius said that humanity experienced spiritual death only, and Adam was simply a bad example for humanity. Everyone is born just as Adam was before the fall, innocent of guilt, with an uncorrupted nature. Because humans are born with an uncorrupted nature, Pelagius taught that humans are always free, and their human will can choose to follow sin and Adam, or a human will can choose righteousness and God. Augustine disagreed strongly. He said that human will is enslaved to sin, and the only choice was to obey the civil laws. Because Augustine taught that sin is inherent in the human nature. Human nature is sinful and produces sin of necessity, and therefore he teaches original sin and disability. Human is disabled, is unable to choose the good. Pelagius, of course, would teach otherwise, that sin is an act of the will, and it is not necessary for a human to sin. There is no original sin, but there is the ability to be righteous. Of course, Pelagius is looking at his own life, but perhaps without true, genuine openness to his own sin. But as he looked at his life, he felt that he had not followed a sin nature and had lived righteously. So he believes that all humans can do as he lived. Now, Augustine taught grace for salvation, that grace is a special work of God's Word and Spirit. Grace is necessary to begin and continue to believe and repent. This is an irresistible gift for those who are elect. It is unconditional and absolute. All right, so we see the ideas of irresistible grace and unconditional election built into Augustine's theology of salvation. Pelagius says that grace for salvation comes from a natural endowment along with other gifts used properly. The grace is conditional, and it's based on a human response. Now, interestingly, both Augustine and Pelagius taught the practice of infant baptism. For Pelagius, infant baptism was unnecessary for salvation. There's no inherited sinfulness that needs to be absolved, but infant baptism still needed to be practiced as necessary for admission to the church. Oh, but not so for Augustine. For Augustine, infant baptism was necessary for salvation. It washes away original sin and guilt. It is the only means of regeneration for those who are born into sin with Adam's guilt. We'll talk more about baptism and the proper candidate for baptism in our next lecture. But notice here that Augustine establishes a code for the entire church, that infant baptism is necessary to wash away the inherited guilt of Adam's sin. And so, whereas before infant baptism was practiced, but not constantly, not universally, after Augustine, we're going to see a turn to infant baptism as the normative practice of the church from 400 until the 16th century, when Anabaptists recover believers' baptism. All right, so that makes Augustine's teaching about soteriology important not only for the doctrine of salvation, but also for the doctrine of the church. Now, interestingly, the church did not adopt immediately Augustine's perspective on soteriology. There were four recognized perspectives to choose from. One was Augustinianism. Salvation comes totally by God's grace, which he gives only to the elect who were previously dead in sin. And then on the other side is Pelagianism. Humanity is born good, with will capable of doing what is necessary for salvation under God's general grace. Let me quickly add at this point that Pelagianism is heresy, all right? Absolutely rejected by church councils, not only at that time, but later on, and even until today. We will not teach that salvation can be earned by our good works, okay? But let me hasten to say that often Pelagianism is confused with Arminianism. Arminianism still would teach that salvation is dependent upon God's grace and God's grace alone. However, according to Arminianism, there is more of an element of human free will that interacts with God's grace to bring about salvation in a person's life. So, Arminianism is completely orthodox. It simply has a different perspective from Augustinianism and the later representative Calvinism. All right? Now, let's continue and look at another perspective, which is called semi-Pelagianism, that God's general grace and the will of humanity work together for salvation when the humans take initiative. All right? Still a heretical view. But now we come to semi-Augustinianism, which teaches that God's special grace comes to all, enabling a human being to choose and to perform what is necessary for salvation. But God takes the initiative. Semi-Augustinianism is the perspective that will be accepted church-wide and go forward into the medieval era. It was adopted officially at the Synod of Orange in 529. So this is a century after Augustine's death, but nonetheless, he still influences the soteriology of the church with some modifications. According to semi-Augustinianism, human free will is incapable of moral goodness without God's grace. God's help is needed in order to make the first move toward salvation. But at the Synod of Orange, the bishops rejected Augustine's doctrine of predestination, saying that the human being does have free will to refuse God's grace. But a human being is not free to be himself or herself apart from God's grace and mercy. And so we see in semi-Augustinianism the understanding that God takes the initiative and God's grace is necessary for salvation. But also the human will is involved and there is a response of good works that is necessary for salvation. And so you'll see how semi-Augustinianism is a doctrine that fits well into the Catholic practice of a works-oriented salvation, where God initiates salvation, but the humanity receives His grace through faith plus works. All right, and so this is semi-Augustinianism: salvation by grace through faith plus works. All right, Augustine's influence is tremendous throughout the history of the church. He is a doctor, that is a teacher of the Catholic Church. Going forward into the medieval era, he'll be considered one of the great teachers. He's the last great father of the early church. His writings shaped the medieval church. We see him in Thomas Aquinas. He also is the favorite theologian of 16th century reformers. Martin Luther comes out of the Augustinian religious order into the Protestant faith. John Calvin is well versed in the early church fathers, but his most quoted father is Augustine. And so Augustine, even today, is considered the most influential theologian of the Western Church, rivaling even the Apostle Paul. All right, but of course, not perfect. And many of us will not agree with all of what Augustine taught, but nonetheless, we recognize in him a giant of the church. And we'll be referring back to Augustine often when we move into the next unit on the medieval era of the church. All right, thank you for your attention to Augustine. I hope this has been profitable for you.